I'm Raman Sukumar. I'm a professor of ecology at the Indian Institute of Science. Over the past 40 years, I've been studying the life of the elephant, its ecology, behavior, and trying to see how we can contribute to its conservation. Among various aspects of the biology of elephants that I have investigated, I have also looked at the cultural history because elephants and humans have had a relationship that goes back several thousand years. And in the modern context of trying to protect elephants, we need to understand this history adequately so that we can come up with pragmatic plans for the conservation of the elephant. And in today's talk, so I will take you back about approximately 4,000 years and relate this relationship between elephants and people in Asia, as well as at the end, I will address this question of how the relationship has been different in Asia than with the African elephant in the African continent. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure that all of you love elephants. And of course, we know that here in India, that elephants and people have shared a very close relationship through history. And I think this is a history that has not been shared by any other creature and humans, ever. And such a relationship is really unlikely to evolve any time in the future. And therefore, there is this really unique relationship between Asian elephants and people, in not only in India, but, in the Asian continent. Well, if you go to Africa, you also have elephants there. You have 10 times the numbers of elephants in Africa as you have in Asia. In Asia, we believe we have about 50,000 elephants in the wild. And in Africa, you have about 400,000 elephants. And actually, this relationship co-evolved in the African continent, because what we think of today as the Indian elephant or the Asian elephant actually evolved in Africa. And, and there was a very close co-evolution between the ancestors of the Asian elephant and humans on the African continent before the Asian elephant migrated into Asia. And once it migrated to Asia, the nature of the elephant-human relationship took on a very different dimension from what continued to persist on the African continent. It is not as though elephants and people in Africa have not shared a cultural history. This is a topic that I will come to at the very end. But, there is a big contrast in the cultural history of the Asian elephant and the African elephant. And, the splendorous relationship, the Asian elephant has actually possibly been a pivot in the rise of Asian civilizations. And but this is something that has never happened on the African continent. And we will examine at the very end why you have this real contrast in the elephant-human relationship in these two continents. Okay, the elephant culture of India, one such expression is this, the Thrissur Puram. Elephants are paraded. This year, for the first time in many decades, possibly this Puram festival was not held, and possibly rightly so. We are kind of awestruck with such a spectacle, but behind the scenes, it is not a very pleasant story to tell. But that's a different story which I will not go into presently. The captive elephant and how we are related to the captive elephant. Although the captive elephant will be a part of the entire narrative of this historical journey that I'm going to take you, going back about 4,000 years to the time of the Harappans. Well, if you actually look at this history, we think of the sacred elephant, and we think that sacred elephant arose with Lord Ganesha. But even prior to that, the sacred elephant actually arose first in Buddhism, and the myth of the legend of the sacred elephant is central to the birth legend of the Buddha himself. And Queen Maya, Gautama Siddhartha's mother, had a dream that a white elephant holding a lotus in its trunk entered its womb. She had a dream, and 9 months later she gave birth to Gautama Siddhartha, who eventually became the Buddha. And you see this clay tablet from Bharut in MP, first century. The clay tablet today can be seen, the depiction of this can be seen in the Indian Museum in Kolkata. Then, of course, we are all familiar with Ganesha, the elephant-headed god, a very lovable god. And this possibly symbolizes the elephant culture of Asia, not just India, but Ganesha is found across Asia. It's found in China, in Japan, and found in Indonesia. It's found in Cambodia. It's found in Myanmar. So it's not Ganesha is not only an Indian or a Hindu god, but a pan-Asian god. And this is in fact the statue that you see here. The picture is a Ganesha from Java, from the 10th century, from 10th century Java. So the question is, what's the significance of the elephant culture in Asia and its contrast with that of Africa? That's the question I'm going to address here. So we go back to the evidence of when was the first elephant tamed in the Indian subcontinent. And the earliest evidence that we have go back to the steatite seals of the Harappan civilization. And some of these, the earlier seals are about 4,600 years before present. And in one of these seals, you can see an elephant figure. And you see something like a cloth draped over the back of the elephant. Okay, that's how a lot of people interpret this. Not everyone is willing to accept this interpretation as saying that that this elephant was a tamed elephant. But nevertheless, it looks very much as though there is a cloth that is draped over the back of an elephant, much like the Kurubas do today. You go to Karnataka, come to Karnataka, and you go to the forests where we have the Kurubas who are the elephant mahouts. They still drape a cloth over the back of an elephant before riding it. But on this elephant, of course, you don't have any person riding the elephant. But then, if you look at the terracotta figurine below, which is a little not as old, it's probably about 3,900 years old. It's very difficult to make out, but there are colors that are smeared on the forehead of this terracotta figurine. And this is very clear indication that this elephant was a tamed elephant. Much like the caparisoned elephants that we see today, they are decorated and they are made to walk in festivals, they are paraded before the public. So something very similar, okay, something very similar was possibly happening, as early as the Harappan times. But this does not mean that the Harappan people were necessarily the first people to tame the elephant. It is likely that the elephant had been tamed, much earlier in the Indian subcontinent, but we don't have any evidence of that. We just have evidence from the Harappan civilization, the great Harappan civilization that spread across a very vast geographical area found in, partly Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of India today. I just then take you from the Harappan period to the Vedic period. If you look at the earliest Veda, the Rig Veda, which is dated at about 1500 BCE, the domesticity of elephant is not very clear in the early Vedic texts, such as the Rig Veda. But in later Vedic texts, like the Atharva Veda of about 800 BCE, there are clear indications that tame elephants were known. There are a number of passages which I'm not going to read out, but there are a number of passages that clearly point to people calling out to a tamed elephant and the elephant doing the bidding of the human and so on and so forth. But we should still remember that during the Vedic times or among the Vedic people and the Vedic culture, the horse remained the most important animal. It was not the elephant. And if you read the Vedas, the Vedic god Indra is essentially associated with the horse. Okay. And it's only much later that Indra, gives up the horse and then rides the fabled elephant Airavata, the six-tusked sacred elephant. So that obviously came at a much later time. So you have the Vedic people coming into the subcontinent and then absorbing a culture that was prevalent, in northwestern India, and that was the elephant culture. So they brought in the horse culture. And then over a period of time, they absorbed the elephant culture, And of course, for Indra, the god of gods in the Vedas, the horse is not as good as that of an elephant in terms of, the grandeur of riding an elephant is very different from that of riding a horse. So I kind of, in my research on the cultural history of the Asian elephant, I looked for the earliest depiction of Indra riding an Airavata. And this is the Baja caves very close to Pune. But this sculpture, of course, is only from the 1st century. So you have this evolution of culture. The Vedic people eventually adopt the elephant into their fold, and they adopt the elephant culture that is already prevalent in the northern part of the Indian subcontinent. Then you come to the first millennium BCE, and you have the rise of elephant armies. You have the concept of the Chaturangani Sene, or the 4 divisions of the army in ancient India. So these 4 divisions included the foot soldiers, the chariot, which of course quickly went out of use. Then you have the horse-based cavalry, and you have elephants. And this is a sculpture from Hoysala. I think it is from Somnathpur in Karnataka. So you see the 4 arms of the 4 divisions of the 4 arms of the army in ancient India over here. The chariot had pretty much, by the 13th century, you never had chariots in battle, but you still see a depiction of the chariot in one of the panels on the top left, on the 3rd panel from the top on the left. You still see a single chariot, and then of course you have the foot soldiers, and you have the horses, and in the base you have the elephants. Now, the use of the elephant in war, I think, is really the defining characteristic of the elephant-human relationship, or the rise of the elephant culture in the subcontinent. The sacredness of the elephant is also essentially defined by the use of the elephant in the army in ancient times. The earliest use of the elephant in war that I have traced is probably approximately the 6th century BCE. And of course, in early times, the elephant was used in a limited fashion, not on a very, very large scale in battle. But then, of course, later on, you had kings capturing hundreds and thousands of elephants and deploying them in battle on a very, very large scale. Now let's go back to a couple of Indian epics, which are about 3,000 years old. One is the Ramayana, of course, and then the next is the Mahabharata, the great epics of India. Now, there are descriptions of elephants in the Ramayana throughout the Ramayana. If you look at the critical edition of the Ramayana, of which I have a full set with me, you find that I actually found that I could relate the entire story of the Ramayana, the entire essential story of the Ramayana, in a few pages by mentioning the elephant in every single sentence. And the essence of the Ramayana, the entire story is captured in that, which means that there are descriptions of elephants throughout. But there are very few descriptions in the Ramayana of the use of elephants in battle. We need to keep that in mind. And at the same time, as Rama came to confront Ravana, as he came southward, Ravana's army actually seemed to have larger number of elephants than that of Rama. And strangely, there's not a single description of Rama riding an elephant in the Ramayana. So this is something we need to keep in mind. And you can look at the critical edition, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, and please let me know where Rama actually rides an elephant, in battle. This is of course a Pahari painting for the sake of illustration, the Battle of Lanka, a Pahari painting from Rajasthan of the 18th century, which Rama rides an elephant into battle. But that's not the case when you actually look at the text of the Ramayana. Then of course, the elephant in the Mahabharata, most of you would be much more familiar with this. Especially there are many more elaborate descriptions of the use of elephants in battle, and the number of elephants on both sides of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, the concept of the Akshavini are obviously hyperbole, because they talk about thousands or tens of thousands of elephants in battle, which is impossible at that time period in Indian history. But nevertheless, elephants were well known by that time, were used in battle, and the concept of the Chaturanga Sena is very, very well established by that time. And the story of Ashwatthama is very well known to all of you, so I will not elaborate on that. And here is a sculpture again from Hoysala, one of the Hoysala temples. It's either Halebid or Belur. And here you have a depiction of Bhima killing Ashwatthama with a mace. And this is, of course, from the 12th century. So certainly by the time of the Mahabharata, you have a deployment of elephants in battle, maybe to a limited extent. I am now going to take you to an ancient elephant lore called the Gajasastra. Now the Gajasastra is attributed to sage Palkapya. Now the mythical sage Palkapya, apart from the Gajasastra, there is no other account of this mythical sage. The Gajasastra is attributed to the sage Palkapya, and who is believed to have lived in eastern India, somewhere between Bihar and Assam, around the 5th century BCE. And there are very detailed descriptions about elephant biology in the Gajasastra. There are a few modern translations of Gajasastra, and I'm just going to read out one single statement from the Gajasastra to show you the scientific insight that the sage Palkapya had. It gives you a very detailed description of an elephant in must. An elephant in must, you must have, I'm sure that most of you would have heard an elephant coming into must. It's a male elephant that, depicts a certain kind of aggressive behavior. There is a fluid that comes out from the must gland that flows. I'll show you a picture later on. And this is similar to a rut in many of the other animals. So this passage from Gajasastra says, excitement, swiftness, odor, love passion, complete fluorescence of the body, wrath, prowess, and fearlessness are declared to be the 8 excellences of must. Now I can tell you that single sentence, essentially summarizes all that we know today about must and the significance of must. Elephant biologists have studied the phenomena of must in great detail. Actually, probably starting in Africa, and it is only in the 1980s that we came to know what the significance of must was in scientific terms. And then later, of course, also in Asia, a number of biologists have studied the phenomena of must. And we know that essentially must in the male elephant occurs only in the male elephant. There's great excitement. It's related to the sexual cycle of the male. When the male elephant comes into must, it wanders over a very large area. It increases what's called its rate of movement, its home range. It sends out a lot of powerful chemical signals, both from the must gland as well as from urine. And the male elephant goes in search of female elephants for mating. And the male is fearless because he is willing to challenge any other male, including an older male, a larger male who is not in must. So essentially that single sentence from the Gajasastra, and this is from the Matagalila translation attributed to Nilakanta Shastri. This single sentence essentially captures all that we know about must today and its significance in elephants. So there was deep knowledge of the biology of elephants in ancient times. And this is a bull elephant in must. I photographed this in the Rajaji Chilla sanctuary probably more than a decade ago. And you can see the must gland, between the eye and the ear, you see the must fluid. And this male is moving at a pretty brisk pace, possibly in search of a herd of elephants for mating with a female. Then, the Gajasastra also talks about the origin, the creation myth of the elephant. You have a lot of ancient myths, and one of the myths is about the elephant. And the origin of elephants is traced to a cosmic event in which Brahma held 2 halves of the cosmic eggshell in his 2 hands and chanted 7 Vedic mantras and so on and so forth. Then you had 8 male elephants and 8 female elephants that came out of each half shell, and they went on to populate the earth. Okay, so we leave the myth aside. But then there is one very interesting sentence in the creation myth of the elephant, the statement about the creation myth. That is that Brahma created elephants for the profit of offering sacrifice to the gods. Okay, but more important than that is this statement, and especially for the welfare of kings. I think that is the real punchline, that elephants are being created for the welfare of kings and rulers. And this is the real theme that really dominates in the cultural history of the elephant and the elephant-human relationship over a period of at least 2,000 odd years in the Indian subcontinent, till, of course, that culture has changed today. But the last part of the creation myth, that is, the elephants are created for the welfare of kings. That is, the kings, have use the elephants in their armies, in warfare. And this is the use of the elephants in warfare go back to 2500 or 3000 years. You all know about Alexander the Macedonian, who made a very brief visit to the Indian subcontinent and then retreated. Alexander, had set his sights upon the conquest of the whole of India. So he comes in from the northwest, from the mountain passes, comes down into the plains. And actually, Alexander himself had some elephants with him. He had picked up some elephants from some of the chieftains in the mountains of the northwest who actually gave him elephants. But Alexander never actually fielded elephants in the famous battle of the Hydaspes, or the battle of the Jhelum against King Porus or Puru in 326 BCE. So King Puru, fielded 80 elephants. He had about 200 elephants, and he seems to have fielded only 80 elephants in the battle. And Alexander defeats Porus. That's a historical story that you all know about. But very interestingly and importantly, the real puzzle is how is it that the Macedonians, who came all the way across half the world, literally, from Macedonia, they conquered Persia, they conquered, a number of other, kingdoms, in their long march, and they come to the Jhelum River, they defeat King Porus or Puru, but then when they come to the Bias River, there is a revolt among the soldiers. The soldiers refuse to go any further. This is because there are rumors that have come into the Macedonian camp that if they were to advance any further and reach the river Ganges, the Nandas were waiting for them. The Nandas were much more powerful kings, and they were waiting for them with a much larger elephant army. And various Greek sources from Megasthenes and others, they put the size of the Nanda army, the elephant army, at between 4,000 and 6,000 elephants. Some historians may actually dismiss, these numbers, 4,000 elephants, 5,000 elephants in ancient times during the time of the Nandas, across the river Ganges, but I've been thinking about it, and I think that it is entirely plausible. Even if the number 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 may not be correct, I think it's entirely plausible that the Nandas had very large elephant armies, because of capture of elephants, from the Himalayan foothills in very large numbers. It is ecologically possible. The population dynamics, the kind of the numbers of the population of elephants and the teeming populations that were there at the foothills of the Himalaya, it was certainly possible to capture several hundred or several thousand elephants and maintain this in ancient times. So I don't see any reason to disbelieve these very large numbers. Okay, even if we can quibble about the exact number of elephants in the army. So in one sense, we can say that Alexander came all the way across to conquer the whole of India. He defeated Puru's army with 80 elephants. But when the soldiers heard that there were thousands of elephants across the river Ganges, they revolted. They said, no, we want to go back. We want to see our families, whether our family is still alive, whether our elderly parents are still alive or not. It's almost like the migrant workers in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, they all want to go back home. And this is what turned the Macedonians back. So we can say that the elephant in some sense saved India. The course of Indian history would have been very different if Alexander had decided to march further into the subcontinent. Of course, we can't make a prediction of what would have happened. But the elephant almost undoubtedly played a role in the retreat of the Macedonians, and definitely Megasthenes, mentions this in his Indica. I then come to a very curious history of Hannibal. Now, Hannibal was the Carthaginian, the general of Carthage in North Africa, who during the 3rd century BCE, he decided to march against Rome, the formidable empire of Rome. And, the story is that Hannibal, crossed the Alps with 37 elephants successfully. And all the 37 elephants of Hannibal, they safely crossed the Alps. And then he came down into northern Italy, into the plains of northern Italy, before making a final thrust to try and conquer Rome. Now, historians have generally have not given much thought to the identity of what elephants these were. It is generally assumed that because at that time period in history, there were elephants in northern Africa. We know today that in the region of the Atlas Mountains, the region that constitutes Algeria and Libya and so on, that you had a remnant population of the African elephant. It was possibly a different species. It became extinct, around this time. But nevertheless, Hannibal possibly captured and trained these elephants. And I have seen rock art of, from this region, which actually depicts elephants. So definitely there were elephants, and elephant fossils have been found in this region. But then, I came across this glazeware pottery from the British Museum. And you look at this glazeware pottery. This is from Etruria in northern Italy, and this is at the time that Hannibal had marched through Etruria in his conquest of Rome. You look very carefully at this. The British Museum label simply says elephant, Etruria, 3rd century BCE. When I looked at it closely, I found that the elephant skull, the dome, had 2 domes on the skull. If you look closely, you have these 2 domes. This is clearly an Asian elephant. This is not an African elephant. The African elephant does not have a dome. The extinct mammoth has a single dome, but the African elephant does not have a dome. The Asian elephant has 2 domes. This is clearly an Asian elephant. So the Asian elephant was known to northern Italy, to Etruria at the time of Hannibal's invasion. And there's a lot of other textual evidence that Hannibal rode an elephant called Surus. And Surus means Syria. And Syria refers to an Asian elephant. So Hannibal's elephant was an Asian elephant. And that elephant survived eventually when many of the other elephants possibly perished. And Hannibal himself, was not successful in his conquest of Rome. But the point I'm trying to make is that an Indian elephant had reached all the way to Rome by the 3rd century BCE and was used by Hannibal in his assault against Rome. So we then come to the elephant culture during the Mauryan times. You know about Chandragupta Maurya, who established the first major empire. The concept of empire, the first empire in India, is attributed to the Mauryans. The Mauryans defeated the Nandas, usurped the kingdom in the north, and established the Mauryan Empire, which extended. Then the extent of the Mauryan Empire is given in this map here. The elephant culture possibly reached an early peak during the Mauryan time under Chandragupta and then Ashoka. By this time, the Indo-Gangetic basin had been almost completely cleared out of the forest and was under extensive settlement. It is not as though no forests. There were still elephants, but I think if you look at kind of the historical evidence, the Indo-Gangetic plain was almost completely devoid of forest by the time of Chandragupta Maurya and the Mauryans and the Mauryan Empire. But there were still plentiful elephants along the Himalayan foothills. The region of the Tarai, which extended from Uttarakhand along the present-day Nepal through Bihar and so on. There were a lot of elephants. Those are areas that were teeming with wild elephants. And of course in Kalinga, the kingdom of Kalinga and Odisha, these had a lot of elephants. And these were sources of elephants to the Mauryan Empire. And if you read the ancient texts, you read Megasthenes, for instance, he states that Chandragupta Maurya, who was the ambassador of Seleucus Nicator in the court of Chandragupta Maurya, he states that Chandragupta Maurya had 9,000 elephants in his army. Okay, even if you don't believe 9,000 elephants, he still possibly had several thousand elephants in his army, and this was entirely possible. But at the same time, let's also remember that this is a clear hint that there was an over-exploitation of elephant populations as early as the Mauryan times. That elephants were captured in the hundreds, and therefore these ancient kings were able to maintain armies with thousands of elephants, in ancient times. Now, we can then come to the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra, you all know, attributed to Chanakya, Kautilya, and the time period of Arthashastra is controversial. Could be anywhere between 300 BCE and 300 CE, although some modern historians put it much later. I'm not getting into that debate. But the Arthashastra is a manual of statecraft. And interestingly, the Arthashastra has a lot of textual material on elephants and how do you capture elephants, how do you maintain elephants, how do you deploy elephants in battle, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm just going to read out a few passages from the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra advocated the setting up of sanctuaries. If you go to the United States, somebody might tell you that Yellowstone National Park is the first national park in the world, for setting up for wildlife protection. I say no. You come to read in the Arthashastra, you had the Gajavanas that were set up at the time of the Arthashastra, the elephant forests. These were sanctuaries, and these were controlled by a superintendent of elephant forests. Much like today you have our national parks and wildlife sanctuaries who are headed by a chief conservator of forests or the principal chief conservator of forests and the chief wildlife warden. So you had a superintendent of elephant forests in ancient times for the protection of elephants. And at that time, the Arthasastra's prescription was that anyone killing an elephant in the Gajavana or the elephant forest had to receive the death penalty. So let me read this passage out. Some teachers say that land with productive forests, when I say productive forest, maybe a production forest like a timber, you're growing a forest for timber, is preferable to land with elephants, because it means the former, the production forest, is the source for a variety of materials. Obviously, they were extracting, the timber and non-forest timber forest produce, just like in more modern times. The ancient times, they were cutting the forest for a range of different products, fuel wood and so on and so forth. But while the elephant forests supply only elephants, Kautilya disagrees. Kautilya disagrees because he says it is not necessary that the production forests are better or preferable to an elephant forest. Because he says that you can create productive or production forests. This is, from a translation by Rangarajan, and I would translate this to create production forests. One can create production forests or timber forests. You can grow plantations on many types of land, but not elephant forests. But the punchline again is this: for one depends on elephants for the destruction of an enemy's forces. So it's very, very clear that these were Gajavanas, these were elephant sanctuaries that were set up by the king, and these forests were to be protected. All the elephants had to be protected because the king could then capture these elephants and he could use them in his army. This is, again, if you really think about it very carefully, this is a very utilitarian view of conservation. Okay, this is not a very romanticized, emotional view of conservation. It's a very utilitarian view. These forests had to be protected because the forest had to supply elephants for the king's army. There's only one passage I came across in the Arthashastra that had a hint of emotion, and that was that an elephant calf, is something to do with about playing with an elephant calf, and there is a hint of emotion in that. But apart from that, Kautilya was a very hard-nosed, kind of a person who advised the king on how to manage the kingdom, the administration of the kingdom. And he said, set up these elephant sanctuaries. Give the death penalty to anyone killing an elephant, because you need those forests for supply of elephants to your army, period. So this is the distribution of the Gajavanas. This is after Thomas Trotman, who drew this map initially, who identified these Gajavanas in 1982. You have the Pratyavana. Up now, you have the Pratyavana, you have the Kalingavana, the Chedi Karusavana, the Dasarnavana, the Angareyavana, the Aparantavana, the Saurashtravana, the Panchanadavana. Okay, and the actual locations are given here. Okay, now interestingly, there is a hint of the ecology of ancient times. Now, if you look at this, the Kautilya Arthashastra says that the elephants are Saurashtravana. Saurashtra is, of course, Gujarat. And the Panchanadavana is the northwest of the country, which is today the Punjab and Haryana and parts of Rajasthan, and so on and so forth. These are mentioned as the worst. These vanas are the worst. Why? Because these probably don't have elephants. They don't have enough number of elephants, or these were degraded forests that did not support the growth of elephants, robust elephants that could be used by the king for his army. So there is a hint of ecological degradation, even in ancient times, at the time of the Arthashastra. When the Arthashastra says that the Saurashtravana, Gujarat, where you have no elephants today, the Panchanadavana in Punjab and Haryana, you have no elephants today. Okay, so elephants had virtually disappeared. by that time. The elephants were there, but the elephants were not of a robust build that the king could capture and use in the army. On the other hand, the Arthashastra states that Kalingavana, which is the Odisha, parts of probably Jharkhand, and the eastern Ghats of Andhra Pradesh and so on, these were the areas that were the best for use, the best elephant forests, and they could supply unlimited number of robust elephants to the king's army. Of course, the Gajavanas does not include the extreme south of the country. What about Kerala and Tamil Nadu? You have elephants today. It's just that during the Mauryan time, the empire never extended to Tamil Nadu and Kerala. Okay, so these Gajavanas are not mentioned. The southern Gajavanas are not mentioned. They are mentioned in later texts, which I will come to. So the capture of elephants, the Arthashastra gives detailed prescriptions about the type of elephant to be captured. Okay, it says that summer is the best time to capture elephants. Easiest to, logistics to go and capture elephants. It says that capture of a calf, capture of an elephant with small tusks, a tuskless male, which is a makana, a diseased elephant, a pregnant or a suckling female should not be caught, was prohibited. So there were prohibitions in ancient times. It is not as though there was indiscriminate necessarily all the time. Of course, the ancients captured elephants in Keddas, where entire herds of elephants were driven into stockades and they were captured. But he says that, Kautilya says that a 20-year-old male had to be captured. So if we eliminate all these other categories that you could not capture, a pregnant female, a suckling female, a calf, a tuskless male, and so on, he prescribed that a 20-year-old tusked male elephant was to be caught. Now, I would interpret this as follows, and that is that tusked male is the most sought after by the king for use in the army, just for the psychological impact that a tusked male, makes on the enemy. And I would also argue that this was the most prudent way of managing an elephant population in conflict with people. It's really today, if you read in the newspapers about elephant-human conflict, you will find that these 10 to 20-year-old males are the ones that come out and raid crops to a much greater extent than other males do. They kill people. They are young males at the stage of dispersal from their elephant families. They cause a lot of problems. And if you capture them and use them in the army, you are reducing elephant-human conflicts. And the king, of course, has these, is able to train them for, use them as psychological weapons to deter the enemy. So these were the prescriptions possibly followed in ancient times. And also I would argue that if this prescription had been followed, there was selective capture of the tusked male elephant as opposed to the tuskless male elephants. And over a period of historical time, because of this selective capture of the tusked male versus the tuskless males, especially in the northern part of the country, you go to places like Assam and West Bengal and so on today, you will find these are the regions where elephants were captured historically in very large numbers. You will find that about 50% of the males do not have tusks. Therefore, through this very selective form of capture of the tusked male, through historical times, the genes for tusks were reduced in the population, started going down, and the tuskless males started increasing in the population. So this is something very, I think, interesting for us to ponder over, that the type of management that the kings had of capturing the tusked male actually has contributed to the pattern, the phenotypic, what we call the phenotypic pattern that we see among the male elephants today in the northeast of the country. I now come to Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka and Gajatami. And this is the first hint that we have of the sacred elephant. So this is a rock inscription from Kalsi, one of Ashoka's famous rock inscriptions. I hope you can see the carving of this elephant. Again, I photographed this about maybe 12 or 13 years ago. This is very close to Dehradun, Kalsi, and this is attributed to 3rd century BCE. So below there is an inscription which says Gajatami, the supreme elephant. This is the earliest hint that we have that elephant actually became sacred in India, in Buddhist India. Ashoka, of course, as you know, converted to Buddhism. And this is, this rock carving from Dauli near Bhubaneswar, and I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with this elephant. So by Ashokan times, we had the concept of the very sacred elephant firmly, part of Indian culture in Buddhist India. And the elephant culture in Buddhism, as gleaned from the Jatakas, says that the king rode a richly caparisoned elephant. And this was a royal estate elephant. And the early Buddhist literature, they clearly mentioned various terms for the elephant: the Hasti Dasana, the Hasti Mangala, Hasti Maha, the Hatti Vatikas, and so on and so forth. And the master of ceremonies for any festival was a person who knew 3 Vedas, not 4 Vedas, so 3 Vedas, and the elephant lore. So the elephant lore was the 4th Veda. If you read the Jatakas, you'll see that the elephant lore is actually referred to as the 4th Veda almost. So the use of elephants in war is clearly established, though there does not seem to be large-scale deployment in the Buddhist times. And I just want to share with you my favorite painting of all times. The Chadanta Jataka in the Ajanta caves of the 4th century. I'm sure that many of you would have seen this near Aurangabad and the Buddhist caves. It's such a wonderful painting. The sacred white elephant, the hunter, comes to kill this elephant, and Chadantaka actually, the Bodhisattva offers self-sacrifice. Comes up to the hunter and asks the hunter to cut off his tusks, and in the process, Chadantaka actually dies from the process. It's I think this is one of the possibly the most, I think evocative elephant painting of all times ever. And then I come to closer to home, which is near Chennai, Madras, Mahabalipuram, where I come to the land of the Tamils. The Sangam literature has a lot of references to the elephant. I don't have enough time in this talk to go into the references to the elephant in the Sangam literature, although not perhaps as detailed as that of the Gajasastra, that still shows a lot of insights about elephants, about crop raiding of elephants, about tame elephants, and about the use of elephants and so on. And the Pallavas, of course, a formidable kingdom in the south. And in Mahabalipuram, you see Arjuna's penance with this magnificent bull elephant carved on this sheer rock. And I would argue that this is my favorite elephant sculpture of all times. This elephant, the proportions, this elephant is so beautifully proportioned. This elephant is more realistic, than any, than any elephant in the wild that you actually see. It's as magnificent as a wild elephant that you can actually see. But to me, you look very closely if you are a, historian of art. Between the eye and the ear, if you look very carefully, you see a little bulge in the rock. I'm sure that most people this has escaped the notice of most people. This is a swollen must gland. This was a must elephant. This is an elephant in must, and that superb sculptor who sculpted this, he had a deep knowledge of elephants. And this is my most favorite elephant sculpture of all times. I now come to the sacred elephant in Hinduism. This is Lord Ganesha, of course. Now, Ganesha does not appear in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I'm making an academic statement. Okay, this is from historians of religion. Very clearly say that there is no Ganesha in the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. The classical Ganesha as we know today, half elephant, half man, with all the other paraphernalia. There are no known images of Ganesha BCE, and the earliest classical images of Ganesha date not later than the 3rd or the 4th century. And the literary reference to Ganesha is also late about the 5th century. So I went in search of the earliest Ganesha ever. Before that, I just want to take a minute or so to argue about why an animal becomes sacred. If you read anthropologist Marvin Harris, and you read his book, Cows, Pigs, Wolves, and Witches, he addresses the question of how the cow became sacred in India. And he argues that, in ancient times, you have the spread of Aryan settlements across the Indo-Gangetic basin, you have intensification of production and population explosion. And 2000 years ago, it's not that just India has 1.3 billion people and the second largest population in the world today. India had the largest population in the world 40,000 years ago. India had the subcontinent had the largest population in the world, 2,000 years ago. So he argues that at some stage, the cow, which became sacred, it became more useful alive than dead, as a source of milk, dung, and more cows and oxen to plow the fields when the rains arrived. So he argues that rainfall was always very variable in the Indian subcontinent, that the monsoon could fail, and farmers who took a short-term view and slaughtered the cow, they lost out when the rains came back. And farmers who did not kill the cow and who maintained the cow and the oxen for plowing their fields when the monsoon returned, they actually benefited. And therefore, it was adaptive for a farmer to take a longer-term view of cost benefits then to slaughter the cow, and therefore the cow became sacred. So I was in search of the earliest forms of Ganesha. And I tell you, these are the two earliest forms of Ganesha that I have found. One is the Udayagiri cave, number 6 from Madhya Pradesh. That's also in Udayagiri in Odisha near Bhubaneswar. That's different. Those are Jain caves. This is a cave where Ganesha is outside, the sanctum sanctorum, where you have Lord Shiva guarding the entrance to Lord Shiva's sanctum. Then you have the Mathura Museum, and from the Kushan times you have this. I have an interesting story about this. This was locked up in a dungeon, which I managed to get out, and I managed to photograph this and see this. But these are the two most ancient depictions of Ganesha ever. But these relate, and historians have dated this, the Kushan period, 4th century at best, late 4th century or early 5th century CE of the Kwam era. There are certain very interesting antecedents of Ganesha, and historian G.S. Gurye, in his book of Gods and Men, actually traces this very interestingly. I'll not get into details, but if you look at the antecedents of Ganesha, Ganesha was first Vinayaka, and Vinayaka is almost like a malevolent spirit, or Vignaraja, which means the creator of obstacles. And over a period of history, the creator of obstacles, or Vinayaka or Vignaraja, eventually is transformed into the classical benevolent Ganesha. And G.S. Gurye notes, and I just quote him, a very radical transformation was needed to enthrone Ganesha, being the lord of obstacles, as the destroyer or removal of obstacles. Such transformation inhere in the very nature of early religio-magical systems. One who is the lord of anything can be trusted to control and subdue the thing he is the lord of. So Vinayaka, the troublemaker, very important note, Vinayaka was originally a troublemaker, becomes the much prayed to trouble averter Ganesha. Okay, very interesting. So I would argue that over a period of time, the elephant, actually, if you look at elephant-human conflict, it's like Vinayaka. To them, these elephant spirits were something to be feared. They were something to be appeased. They were something to be worshipped by local people, the agriculturalists and the tribals, because it could cause great destruction. But then at some point in history, the elephant was no more a threat to the elite of Aryan society, the kings and rulers of Aryan society, because the elephants were completely eliminated across the Indo-Gangetic plains. Elephants were found only in the foothills of the Himalaya, and then further south along the forest fringes in central India. And therefore, to the rulers of Aryan society, the elephant was more useful alive, in armies and as a beast of burden, than dead for meat or ivory. So the elephant eventually became a very positive force. And thus we can draw a parallel with the sacred cow and say how the elephant became sacred is that the elephant became sacred because the elephant was useful, especially alive in the armies of kings and as a beast of burden. And we should remember that the elephants essentially were pivotal in the rise of civilizations across Asia. And there are possibly a lot of parallels with today's social conflicts over conservation, where people living in forests, small-time cultivators and agriculturalists are very reluctant to look upon the elephant as a positive force. While the rest of society, the elite conservationists who lived in cities and towns, we want the elephant to be protected at all costs, sometimes irrespective of the costs that have to be borne by the marginal farmers and the tribals. So I would argue that Ganesha is a deity born out of conflict. If you look at the symbols associated with Ganesha, you have sugarcane, you have radish, you have a bowl of sweets. All these are agricultural. All these are related to food. So a tribal elephant-related deity, originally appeased to avoid personal ills, was possibly eventually incorporated into the Vedic traditions. And this is a recurring theme in Brahminical Hinduism. But whatever Ganesha is ultimately the ultimate triumph of an idea. And this is what I have written about in 2 of my books. My book, The Living Elephants in 2003, and more recently, the Story of Asia's Elephants. The first quote is, whatever the interplay of social, economic, political, and religious factors in ancient India, it is a historical fact that by about 1200 years ago, the elephant had risen to the status of an important god and a universal taboo on its killing and consumption firmly established. The second quote is, whether through a brilliant flash of inspiration or through a more gradual process of change and acceptance, a popular icon was raised to supreme godhead. I would even surmise that Ganesha was Hinduism's response to Gajatame and Mangalahati of Buddhism, or perhaps a force in the former's, or that is Hinduism, resurgence and the latter's decline. I rest my case here. I now come to the Manasolasa. The Manasolasa is an ancient text attributed to King Somadeva, the Western Chalukyan king, Somadeva III. And very interestingly, the Manasolasa introduces the concept of participatory wildlife management. The Manasolasa repeats a lot of text from the Arthasastra, and it states that the elephant forest, the Gajavana, is the best type of forest. But it has an additional rider not found in the Arthasastra. And this rider is that the king should protect it with the help of forest dwellers, not necessarily with the superintendent of elephant forest or the Nagavana Vana Dakshya, as it states in the Kautilya Arthasastra. So here there's something very interesting happening, by the 12th century of the Common Era, that Kautilya Arthasastra says, you set up these forests, you have the superintendent of elephant forest, the Naga Vana Dakshya, and then you impose the death penalty on anyone killing the elephant in the Gajavana. But Manasolasa says no, the king should protect the elephant with the help of forest dwellers. Very, very interesting. Whether we can learn some lessons from it today for modern day conservation. The Manasolasa also has another interesting passage, and that is it adds Aparanta Vana to the Saurashtra Vana and the Panchananda Vana as being inferior for elephants. So Aparanta Vana is the present day northern Western Ghats of Maharashtra. There are no elephants today in the northern the Western Ghats of Maharashtra today. So Aparanta Vana had become degraded by the 12th century CE, and possibly it could not hold elephants anymore. So some of these ancient texts also give us a chronological sequence of how habitats have changed, how the distribution of animals have changed, and so on and so forth. We then come to the elephant in the Sultanate period. We had the Islamic rulers who started coming into the subcontinent around the 11th century, and we had the Ghuris and the Ghaznavids. They maintained, again, very large elephant armies, although they came in with horses and with cavalry. The Delhi Sultans built up large pilkhanas. These are the elephant stables. And in 1340 CE, the pilkhana of the Delhi Sultanate held about 3,000 elephants, and a fourth of them fit for use in battle. This is the figures given by Simon Digby. Finally, but on the other hand, when we had Timur or Tamerlane, who came in from the north, swept in and conquered almost everything in his path, he defeated the Delhi Sultanate in 1398. And by the time, the Pilkhana had held only 120 war elephants. So it's very clear that there was over-exploitation of elephants, that the Sultanate was not able to maintain elephants. They never had the force of elephants, the elephant corps, as was there, even among the early Delhi Sultans. And Simon Digby says that the reduction in the Pilkhana, the size of the Pilkhana, was one factor that played a role in the defeat of the Sultanate in 1398. I then go to the elephant in the Mughal times. The Mughal rulers like Akbar were connoisseurs of elephants. The Babar and Akbar hunted elephants. But this hunting of elephants, interestingly, is not the hunting means it's not killing elephants. This actually seems to indicate that the Islamic rulers seem to have respected the prevailing sentiments of, you can call it Hindu or Buddhist or whatever you want to, of the sacred elephant. The Mughal hunt of elephants were captures of elephants for using in the army, for maintaining in the army. The Mughals continued to build up large elephant armies. And there are British accounts which say that Jahangir had 9,000 elephants in his army and an estimated 40,000 elephants in his kingdom. The 40,000 elephants in his kingdom is obviously, captive wild and captive elephants perhaps. And so maybe an indication approximately of the numbers of elephants that were there in the subcontinent at the time of the Jahangir in the Mughal period. We then come to the elephant in the British times. The British coveted the elephants for a different reason. The British set up, the reserve system of reserve forests. They wanted to exploit the timber resources, especially the teak forests of India, for supply to the railways and to the shipyards, and for the war effort later on in Britain. And they set up the forest department in the mid-19th century. And Logging the teak forest required the scientific management of elephants and using of elephants in dragging the timber out of the forest into the rivers and taking it out eventually. And therefore, they set up these reserve forests. They set up, they captured elephants, they maintained elephants for logging operations. Again, very utilitarian. They also set up game preserves, a so-called game preserve, to ensure protection to animals. But then they hunted these animals for sport hunting. Now, sport hunting was alien to the Indian ethos, especially sport hunting of elephants. Let us remember that the Buddhist, the Hindu, and the Islamic rulers never killed elephants for sport. They possibly hunted other animals, but not the sacred elephant. But then the British introduced the concept of sport hunting in a much larger scale in Africa, of course, to a lesser extent perhaps in Asia. But nevertheless, you had sport hunting of elephants in Asia too. And large numbers of elephants, hundreds of elephants were eliminated in places like the Wayanad. In Sri Lanka, there were British officers who killed, a few thousand elephants. And historian John Mackenzie interprets big game hunting as, culturally, he interprets this as a contemporary rediscovery of medieval chivalry. And this is linked to ritualized warfare and killing. But thankfully, after sometime in the late 19th century, the British stopped the killing of elephants and they enacted the Elephant Protection Act of the Madras Presidency, after which the elephants were protected, presumably to supply elephants for the timber industry. And then later, of course, after independence, we protected the elephant under the Wildlife Protection Act. I now come to an important figure in India's independent history, the history of Indian independence. And this is Bal Gangadhar Tilak. The nationalist leader, and you all know that he converted Ganesha into a powerful symbol of resistance against the British. There is a whole history that you can tell about how Tilak converted Ganesha. He mobilized the people behind Ganesha. And there are, archival material from the British period that clearly indicate that, this symbol, they were totally alarmed. They were puzzled as to how Tilak could mobilize people behind this very strange symbol of half elephant, half man, half beast, half man, Ganesha. And they didn't know how to deal with this. But eventually, of course, we got Indian independence in 1947. And I would state that Indian independence can be said to be a triumph of the nationalist elephant. And Ganesha played a role in this over the imperial lion. The lion was the symbol of the British Empire. But strangely, do you know what we did after Indian independence? We had to choose a national animal. And the national animal that we chose was not the elephant, which I think has its rightful place as a national animal. But we chose the lion as a national animal initially. Today, we have the tiger, which is again a late entrant into the Indian subcontinent from China, only about 10 or 12,000 years ago. But the elephant evolved in the Indian subcontinent. And it's only about 10 years ago that we gave the status of the national heritage animal to the elephant in the country. Post-independence in India, it's a whole story by itself. There's laws on fragmentation of habitat, elephant-human conflicts, there's poaching for ivory, and there is a crisis of the captive elephant, which I will not go into. It's a different talk altogether. I will now very briefly in the next few minutes go into the issue of African cultures and why the same relationship did not arise, or did it arise in Africa? Why that kind of the relationship that arose in Asia, not only in India, but across in Burma, in Cambodia, the very close relationship between elephants and people. Now, native African peoples also relate the African elephant to their social lives, and in symbolism and metaphor. And there is a lot of material on this. But essentially, this remained at a totemic level. And this is, of course, natural. There is a certain relationship because the elephant itself evolved in Africa, and elephants and humans have co-evolved in Africa over millions of years. And therefore, there is a cultural relationship between the native African people and the elephant there. And Hannibal's army, which I mentioned earlier, it certainly had a large number of African elephants, which he then took across the Alps to try to conquer Rome. But the important question is, why did this African elephant culture die out? You had an African elephant culture in Northern Africa. Why then did the culture of capturing and training African elephants die out. You don't have that culture today. I would argue that this elephant culture that we know in Asia, in India, it is associated with the rise of major republics and kingdoms. You know, with the Mauryan, with the Nandas, with the Mauryan kingdom, and a whole range of other kingdoms and republics that arose in India and other parts of Asia. You know, the Khmers in Cambodia, for instance. In Africa, this was not backed by the advantage of biogeography. Now, let me explain what I mean by the advantage of biogeography. The Carthaginians, who exploited the elephants of northern Africa, they only had a remnant elephant population. They had a small elephant population to exploit. There was not a teeming elephant population, you know, which was there in the tens of thousands or the hundreds of thousands as you had in Asia. They only had possibly in the hundreds or perhaps a few thousands. The Egyptians did not have access to the vast populations of sub-Sahara, although you had a civilization in Africa, the Egyptian civilization. No major republics, kingdoms arose in sub-Saharan Africa when elephant cultures were on the ascent in Asia and Mediterranean. There was a small kingdom called Miro in Africa, but I will not get into details of that. They used elephants in a limited way in the Sudan. But let me show this to you. If you look at the places where you had elephants in Africa, the red line indicates the distribution of the African elephant, mostly sub-Saharan, to some extent across into northern Africa. And this is the Carthaginian kingdom, the Atlas Mountains. You see, they don't have the advantage. You have a small population in a mountainous region that is exploited, it is finished, goes extinct. This is the Egyptian kingdom along the Nile, and they had no access to elephants. The elephants are all found further south. They are found south of the Sahara. So in Asia, we had the advantage of biogeography. We had kingdoms, republics, kingdoms, and empires arising in the Indian subcontinent across Southeast Asia. You know, Burma, Thailand, you know, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and these were forests that were teeming with thousands and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of elephants. So this population could be exploited for a much longer period of time than they did. That culture arose in Africa, it died out within a few hundred years. The culture arose in Asia, it survived for at least 2,000 or more years. And then, of course, that culture has gone. So my final thesis here is this. In Asia, rulers from the Mauryans to the Mughals, 2,000 years, captured elephants for the army. The British introduced sport hunting in addition to capturing them for logging. In Africa, the elephant was seen only as a resource to be exploited for the vast ivory trade that even funded the imperial expansion. The last few hundred years, you know, thousands of African elephants have been killed for the ivory trade. Therefore, in Asia, the elephant was more useful alive than dead. In Africa, the elephant was more useful dead than alive. So this has been the contrast in the cultural relationship between Africa and Asia. And so with that, this is a story that I have told in my book, The Story of Asia's Elephants, published about 9 or 10 years ago. Thank you very much. And I think I'll come back in a few minutes to take any questions that you might have. Thank you. So hello everyone. Thanks for listening to this podcast or whatever you call it. Probably this is the first time I'm doing it so elaborately. I'm essentially a biologist who would like to be out in the field watching wild elephants. But the lockdown has meant that, you know, I'm confined to home for several weeks. Very frustrating indeed. But interesting questions that you have asked. So let me just read out, one by one and try to see if I can answer them. And please forgive me if I'm not able to do justice to an answer, because essentially at the core, I'm a biologist. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a historian, but I've written about the history of the elephant. Okay, the first question is by Yadubir Singh Rawat. And the question is there a reference for Saurashtra in Arthashastra? Is there a reference for Saurashtra in Arthasastra? Yes, very much. Because Saurashtra Vana, it's spelled out exactly as it is. There are two regions you can recognize from when you read the Arthasastra. One is Kalinga Vana. Kalinga, we know, is Odisha. Everyone knows that. The second is Saurashtra Vana. So Saurashtra Vana is very much referred to. And if you read the paper by Trotman, 1982, he has mapped out the extent of the Saurashtra Vana, Gujarat and part of Kutch and the part of the northern part of the Western Ghats. So the answer to that is yes. Saurashtra Vana. That's very simple. The second question is from Shilpa Vadekar. Is there any tribal community worshipping elephant and wearing mask of an elephant? It's a very interesting question. I wish I knew the answer. Sorry, I don't know the answer to this. All that I will say is that I would be very interested. In fact, in recent years, I've been very interested in looking at the relationship between tribals and elephants. By and large, we study elephants themselves. We study the response of agriculturalists, society, conservationists, and so on. But really, the tribal elephant relationship across the country, different tribal groups in southern India and central India and northeast India, they all probably have very different outlooks. And I even had a very small study which has just for about a year or so that has looked at human attitudes towards elephants among different communities, including tribals. But I have not come across any tribal community directly worshipping elephants. Sorry, if any of you know about it, please write to me. The third question is, what is the earliest archaeological occurrence of elephant bones from the time of the Harappan civilization? And this is by Selva Kumar. I can't give you a date, but elephant bones are definitely found in Harappan archaeological sites. And sometimes these bones, they say, are charred. I don't think that's necessarily evidence that elephants were sacrificed or whatever. That's a later question. But all that I can say right now is that I'll look up the exact date. I need to sort of go into the papers. But definitely there are elephant bones that have been found during the time of the Harappan civilization. Most probably the mature Harappan civilization, but I'll have to check that out precisely for you. The fourth question is there any reference to sacrifice of elephant in religious rituals? Abhijit Sadale. I don't know. I have not come across any reference to sacrifice of elephants in religious rituals. Animal sacrifice is, of course, very common. Sacrifice a number of other animals. But I suspect that once the elephant became sacred by the Buddhist times, then you don't go and sacrifice elephants, in religious rituals. And the only part of the country where people eat elephant meat is the northeast of the country. Certain tribes eat elephant meat, but they don't have religious rituals, So if you take sort of mainstream, Indian subcontinent, religious traditions and so on, I have not come across any reference to the direct sacrifice of elephants in a religious ritual. Again, if anybody has any reference so please send it across to me. I'll be very thankful. The next question is, what is the earliest evidence of Ganesh? Okay, I thought I answered that question. This is from Mala Malla. And I thought I answered that question because the earliest evidence of the classical Ganesha as we know today, half elephant, half man, with all the paraphernalia associated with Ganesh, the jolly, benevolent Ganesh as we know today, is really from the late 4th or the early 5th century. And I actually put up a couple of slides of the depiction of the earliest Ganeshas in sculpture. And this is from Udayagiri cave in Madhya Pradesh. And from the Mathura Museum, there is a sculpted Ganesh there. And there are a number of textual references. I urge Mala to read a book. It's very difficult to get hold of this book. It's a very old book by G.S. Gurye, a historian from Maharashtra. And he wrote this book called Gods and Men, of Gods and Men. But even otherwise, there are other books. There's a book published on Ganesh the Benevolent from Marg Publications in Mumbai. And they have a lot of articles on Ganesha and the origin of Ganesha and so on. So Ganesh the Benevolent, published by Marg. Dr. Pal, P-A-L, Pal is the, Pratap Aditya Pal is the editor of that volume, and you will get more details. Also, my book of the story of Asia's elephants, I have a half a chapter on Ganesha in that. But 4th or 5th century of the Common Era, that's the earliest evidence of Ganesh. And then, of course, the stories of Ganesha is elaborated in the Puranas and so on later on. The next question by Alkesh Saveri. Sir, you didn't mention any connection between Lakshmi and elephants. Sorry. I know I didn't mention. In 1 hour, there's only so much I can mention. You know, you have Gajalakshmi, of course, and I refer to Gajalakshmi in my book. This is a tradition that came later during the Puranas, I suppose. The connection, there is a very interesting article written by Navarani. I forget the exact, the first name of this person. It's an initial. But he talks about Lakshmi, the lotus and the elephant. And I think because Lakshmi is associated with the lotus, and the elephants would come and drink in lakes and ponds, which would be filled with lotuses, right? Lilies and lotuses would be very common. Even today, you go to many forest areas, or even at the fringe of the forest areas, you have a pond where you have lotuses growing, and the elephants come and drink water from that. You know, the concept of Gajalakshmi would have arisen from that. That's the connection between these two. I've elaborated a little more in my book. The 7th question is Jayasimha. Namaste, regret to join late. Please mention something about Gajasastra, which is systematic and scientific studies. Yes, I actually mentioned quite a bit about Gajasastra. Gajasastra is attributed to sage Palkapya, who lived somewhere in eastern India, you know, maybe Bihar, maybe Assam. Let me mention that Gajasastra actually has the first reference to elephant-human conflict. You know, Gajasastra, in the Gajasastra, the king, the Romapada of Anga, you know, Anga is in Bihar, present-day Bihar. The people come to the king and make a plea with the king to capture the wild elephants that are ravaging their crop fields. Okay, so elephant-human conflicts are ancient. It's not necessarily very new. So what Romapada does is Romapada sends his men out, and he goes and has the elephants rounded up. And the myth of, you know, when does the Gajasastra start, if you ask me? I think it goes back, the lore goes back to at least the 5th century or so BCE, before the Common Era. So the elephants are caught and brought to the palace grounds and tied up. And then sage Palkapya appears. Sage Palkapya may have been from Assam actually. There is evidence that the geographical origin of Palkapya is from Assam. But nevertheless, you know, sage Palkapya appears before the king, Romapada, and then makes a plea with the king to release the elephants back into the wild. It is almost like modern day conservationists. You know, this is an example I didn't mention in my talk. You know, an elephant is captured and they say, no, leave the elephant back into the wild. You know, there's a conflict of interest here. The conflict of interest is that elephant lovers, conservationists, all of us who are safe from elephants, we want to see the elephant back in the wild. But the local people, you know, the small-time agriculturalists, subsistence farmers, they want the elephant to be captured and kept in captivity because elephants ravage their crop fields. So then sage Palkapya then says that he has wandered among the wild elephants. He comes and appears before King Romapada and begins to relate the life history of the elephant. So that is the Gajasastra. And I mentioned about how descriptions of mast in the elephant, very, very nice descriptions of mast are given in the Gajasastra and the life histories and so on. How do you treat a wild elephant? I mean, how do you treat an elephant in captivity? Almost there is the medicine or the veterinary care of elephants and so on and so forth. So Gajasastra is the ancient elephant lore. It's also mentioned in some of the Jatakas that it is advisable for a prince to know the 3 Vedas, not 4 Vedas, 3 Vedas on the Gajasastra. A lot of very interesting scientific insights. Then the next question is how many, sorry, some of the questions are repeated again, just one second. Namaste, Jayasimha is over. Not Jan, okay. There's a long question by Pratik Chakrabarti. Thank you for a fascinating. I was especially interested in the identification of the Carthaginian elephant, okay, which has been discussed for quite some time. The example you showed from the British Museum definitely had features resembling Indian elephants, convex foreheads and the two domed head, which I said. But which region did the Carthaginians procure these elephants from? Okay, it must be from the kingdom of Carthage, which must be the northern part of the Atlas Mountains. I think that's where the elephants must have been sourced from. But those elephants also, there is a certain amount of rock art which I hope to one day go and see. I've seen these figures, but it is from the northern region of the Atlas Mountains, and elephants were thinly distributed at that time. Hannibal's personal elephant was named Surus, which I mentioned in my talk briefly, which some people have translated as Syrian. That's correct. So they may have drawn from Western Asiatic elephant populations. Yes, correct. So I think there was a trade in elephants, and from India, trained elephants were being taken possibly along with their mahouts. In fact, in my book, I have also given the possibility of the mahouts who accompanied Hannibal, that there could have been Indian mahouts from here, who took the elephants across to West Asia, into Europe, and then eventually, got into those elephants possibly reached northern Italy, and that glazeware pottery is unmistakable. That's an Asian elephant. The British Museum does not know about it. They simply have labeled this as an elephant. But there was a trade in elephants, and those elephants had reached northern Italy. Okay, the next question is coastal Karnataka. Sulochana Mesta. Why coastal Karnataka below the Western Ghats lost elephants? 15 to 20 years ago, a tusker was found dead in Gersopa forest. Even now, see, one thing is that coastal Karnataka, coastal areas have very dense evergreen forest. And those kinds of evergreen forests are not really the optimum habitat for elephants. I'm not saying that elephants cannot survive, but generally evergreen forests are not good for elephants. Elephants are found in slightly drier type of forest, which is found to the eastern side of the Western Ghats. So that's where in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, you get very large elephant populations, very dense elephant populations even today. But elephants would have been found there. But those are areas that were settled by people. The coastal areas were settled, historically. And therefore, elephant would have been eliminated. Thus, relatively low abundance of elephants would have been eliminated by people when the elephants came and raided crops. And that, I believe, is the reason why the elephants disappeared. But even today, you find a few elephants, both in coastal Kerala and in coastal Karnataka, that do get over, and sometimes they are found dead, as pointed out. The 11th question is, I wonder why the elephant could not attain the status of totem in Africa, by Harshavardhan. Sorry, Harshavardhan, okay. Actually, what I meant was the elephant attained totemic status in Africa, but the elephant remained at the totemic status by and large, did not attain godhood. That's the fascinating difference in the cultural relationship between African elephant and Asian elephant. In Asia too, in early times, it would have been totemic, but then went on to attain godhood, both in the form of the sacred white elephant of Buddhism and in the form of Ganesha in Hinduism. Okay, so in Africa, it remained at the totemic level. And that's the reason why, towards the end of my talk, I gave the reason why the difference was there, that it attained godhood in Asia because of the supreme utility of the elephant, for as being a beast of burden to us, as for use in the king's armies and so on and so forth. So that's the reason why it was raised to godhead in Asia, but not in Africa. The 12th question is, what are connections between Lakshmi and elephant in various regions, which I already answered earlier. There is a connection. The lotus, the pond, where the Lakshmi is associated with the lotus. Elephants come to ponds and drink water and so on. The next question is, how many genetic variation in South Indian elephants? This is a very technical question. If I start giving you an answer, it will go on for a long time. So I will not give a full lecture on the genetic variation. You just Google Sukumar, or you Google Vidya, and then you say genetics elephants, you will get a large number of technical papers on the subject. My student Vidya did this work, more than a decade ago. We have published a number of papers. But essentially, if you look at elephants in South India, it is one single species. There is a certain difference, a small difference between elephants north of the Palakkad Gap and south of the Palakkad Gap. Elephants north of the Palakkad Gap can all trace their matri line or their female lineage to a single haplotype, what is called as a single mitochondrial haplotype. While elephants to the south can trace to different haplotypes, which are 4 or 5 different haplotypes, but they are all the beta clade haplotype. So these are all technical answers. More details are given in a book that, in a paper that we published in the journal Heredity. Just Google Vidya or Google Sukumar and Google elephant genetics, South India, and then you will get this. You will get these papers. The next question is there a reference to sacrifice of elephants in religious by Abhijit, religious rituals of tribe community? I answered this earlier. I have not come across any instance. If there is any textual evidence or otherwise, please get back to me. The elephant became sacred in India, at least, during Buddhist times, 2,500 years ago. So after that, it would have been taboo to sacrifice elephants. And then the 15th question. Okay, some more questions have come in. Please tell us about the white elephant. Like we know Myanmar and Thailand and so on, Hyderabad. Oh, I've written about the white elephant in my book. There are the white elephant wars. You go to Myanmar and you go to Thailand, these are Buddhist countries mainly. And in Buddhism, Queen Maya dreamt that a sacred white elephant descended into her womb from heaven. And then 9 months later, she gives birth to Siddhartha Gautama, who went on to become the Buddha, right? So the sacred elephant, so the Buddha is believed to be the reincarnation of a sacred white elephant in Buddhism. Therefore, this white elephant was much coveted after by the rulers of Southeast Asia. Not so much South Asia. A true white elephant is a genetic variant, is a mutant, and very, very rare in nature, because normally it will not survive. I've seen, for instance, a photograph of a white elephant, a calf in Sri Lanka, some years ago, taken by a friend of mine called Prutu Fernando. But that elephant, I've never seen a photograph later taken of it after it grew up. Such elephants normally do not survive in the wild. But because the elephant is associated with the Buddha, the sacred white elephant, the kings and rulers thought that white elephants will bring them luck. And therefore they, kept these elephants, and the kings would fight with each other for possession of these white elephants. And there were these white elephant wars, I think during the 18th century or so. You just Google white elephant wars, Southeast Asia, and Google, and you will get the whole history of that. So I've seen white elephants. I've seen white elephants in Burma and Myanmar. The next question is Subhabroto Banerjee. You mentioned about how some of the sources go into a fair amount of geographical detail regarding location of elephant forests. I presume you mentioned the Arthashastra and the Manasolosa. Do we have any references to elephant migrations in any of these sources, or even the regional travel routes? I wish we had, but unfortunately no. We don't get long. We get some figures of populations, because you read the Jatakas, and you will get references to the Bodhisattva being the leader of a herd of 8,000 elephants or 80,000 elephants in some cases. So I always say that in ancient times, maybe you had something like between 8,000 and 80,000 elephants in the Himalaya, which is a very plausible figure. You can have between 8,000 and 80,000. It's not impossible. It's not 8 lakhs or 8 million would have been too much, but 8,000 is certainly possible, and even 80,000 is possible across the entire Himalayan range. And even today, when you make population estimations of certain species, statistically you get very wide variation. So you get these kinds of figures from ancient writings, but in terms of migrations, not really routes and so on. Unfortunately, no. Maybe more in the European literature where they talk about elephant migrations and so on, but not in ancient literature. unfortunately. Then the next question is by Vijay Kumar. And the penance panel elephant tusk is actually split at the end. Further, your views on Pullayar Patti. See, Airavadam dates of the inscription. I'm not very familiar with this. All that I will say that the tusks, splitting of the tusks, that can happen in nature occasionally, and that perhaps gives rise to the myth of the four-tusked elephant or the six-tusked elephant. They don't really have six tusks, but they have tusks that are split. The Pullayar Patti, I'm not very familiar with this. So if Mr. Vijay Kumar could send me some details, I'll try to look into it and try to give a response later. If you can send me an email. I'd like to know about the article, Akhilesh Jhaveri. I'll send you a reference to that later. Okay. I'll probably send it to one of the organizers of this and they can pass it on to you. I don't have Akhilesh's email ID. Then, Anapati, okay. Shilpa Vadekar sent this. The book N.P. Joshi, Bharatiya Murti Shastra, Anapati. Please go through. I'll try and go through. If anybody has a link to that, please send that to me because I'm always looking for ancient texts on the elephant. Okay, I think that's it for the present, and thank you all very much, and thanks very much for joining. And if you have any more questions or anything, you can certainly always engage with me. I see also some very prominent archaeologists have joined this talk, and my apologies for anything that might look very naive to you all because I'm a biologist. I'm not an archaeologist or a historian per se. But what fascinated me about the elephant was that this very close relationship, and unlike many biologists, I really feel we really need to understand this relationship in depth and in detail, and only then we can understand how to pragmatically conserve the elephant today. Because you have had this long history, and without the historical context, you really can't plan for the conservation of elephants in the wild today. Thank you very much.